About 4 years ago, my husband and I were on a long road trip, the kind where you don't rush and you let the road decide the pace. We had driven through many quiet and remote places before, so neither of us was particularly nervous about being far from towns or main highways. In fact, we were used to it. At the time, we were living deep in the remote woods of northern Idaho, surrounded by trees, wildlife, and long stretches of land where you could drive for miles without seeing another person. Places like that had always felt normal to us, even comforting in a strange way. That's why what happened on this trip stood out so sharply. We were traveling through southern Oregon, somewhere along that long stretch between Grants Pass and Crescent City. It was daytime, not late or dark, and the weather was calm. The sky was clear, and the drive itself was beautiful. Tall trees lined the road, and the landscape felt wide and open, the kind of scenery that usually makes you want to slow down and take it all in. There was nothing obviously wrong or threatening about the area, at least not at first. At some point, we pulled off the highway and stopped at what I can only describe as a small roadside park. It wasn't busy at all. There were a few picnic tables, some trees, and a sense of quiet that felt deeper than normal. We decided to stop there for lunch. It seemed like a good idea at the time, just a simple break from driving. We sat, ate, and talked, and everything felt fine. Looking back, nothing about that moment should have raised any alarms. After lunch, for reasons I still can't clearly remember, we decided to drive down a dirt road that led away from the park and into the woods. This wasn't something we normally did. We weren't the type to randomly explore unfamiliar back roads without a good reason. Even now, I find it strange that neither of us questioned the decision at the time. It was almost like we both agreed without really thinking it through. The dirt road was narrow and uneven, winding its way deeper into the forest. Trees crowded in on both sides, their branches stretching overhead. At first, it just felt like a typical forest road. We had driven plenty of similar roads before, especially living where we did. But the farther we went, the more something started to feel off. It wasn't a sudden fear. It was a slow, creeping discomfort that settled into my chest. As we continued driving, the feeling grew stronger. The road seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. The forest felt thicker, heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing in. I started to feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. There were no strange sounds, no movement in the trees, no signs warning us to turn back, and yet every instinct in my body was telling me that we shouldn't be there. I remember glancing at my husband and noticing that he was quieter than usual. His focus on the road felt tense, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. That's when I finally said it out loud. I told him that I didn't like the feeling of this place and that I thought we should turn around. I half expected him to brush it off or tell me I was overthinking it. Instead, he agreed immediately. That alone scared me more than anything else. He didn't question it. He didn't ask why. He just said that he felt the same way. There was a shared understanding between us in that moment, a silent agreement that whatever this feeling was, it wasn't something to ignore. We kept driving until we found a spot wide enough to turn around on the narrow dirt track. The road didn't offer many options, and for a moment I felt trapped, like we were being pulled deeper into the woods against our will. When we finally found a place to turn around, the relief was immediate but incomplete. Even as we turned the car, I felt like we were being watched, though there was nothing I could see to support that fear. As soon as we started heading back the way we came, the tension in my body didn't ease the way I expected it to. Usually, once you decide to leave a place that makes you uncomfortable, you feel better. This time, the unease lingered. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the trees, half expecting something to step out onto the road or appear between the trunks. Nothing did. The forest remained silent and still. We didn't speak much as we drove back toward the main road. There was no need to. We both knew how the other felt. It was unsettling in a quiet, heavy way, the kind of fear that doesn't come with panic or adrenaline, but with a deep sense that something isn't right. Once we reached the highway again, things slowly began to feel more normal. The open road, the wider view, and the familiar sound of passing cars helped ground us. Still, the memory of that dirt road and the feeling it gave us stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can recall it clearly. What makes the experience so strange is that we were not easily frightened people. Living in remote woods had taught us to trust our instincts, but also not to overreact to unfamiliar places. We had been in areas far more isolated than that dirt road, places with no cell service, no nearby towns, and plenty of wild animals. None of those places ever made us feel the way that stretch of road did. I've tried to explain it logically. Maybe it was just the isolation combined with an unfamiliar area. Maybe it was a coincidence that both of us felt uneasy at the same time, but the feeling was too strong, too immediate, and too shared to dismiss completely. It wasn't just nerves, it felt like a warning. Even now, when I think back on that drive between Grants Pass and Crescent City, I remember that sense of heaviness settling in as we went farther into the woods. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing actually happened. There were no strange sightings or unexplained sounds, and yet the fear was real. Sometimes the most unsettling experiences aren't the ones where something obvious goes wrong. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a quiet moment where your instincts tell you that you don't belong somewhere, and the smartest thing you can do is listen and leave. That's what we did that day, and I'm still glad we trusted that feeling and got out when we did. Over the summer, I went on a road trip with my sister, her partner, and their dog. It was meant to be a relaxed journey through southern Oregon and northern California, the kind of trip where you don't rush and you let the road unfold naturally. We weren't chasing anything specific, just enjoying the drive, the scenery, and the feeling of being away from everyday life. None of us expected that one short stop along the way would become the most unsettling part of the entire trip, something we still talk about because we can't fully explain what happened. We started out on Interstate 5 and eventually left it near Grants Pass, Oregon. From there, we turned onto Highway 199, heading toward the coast. Almost immediately, the landscape changed. The road narrowed, the trees grew thicker, and everything felt more enclosed. It was still a beautiful day. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and the forest looked calm and inviting. I've driven through mountain roads and wooded areas many times before, so there was nothing about the scenery itself that should have made me uncomfortable. And yet, not long into the drive, I started to feel strange. It's hard to describe exactly what that feeling was. It wasn't fear, at least not at first. It was more like a heaviness settled over me, like something was slightly off. I remember thinking that the air felt different, almost thicker, even though there was no real reason for that. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't want to be dramatic or influence how the others felt, especially since nothing had actually happened. But the feeling stayed with me as we continued driving. As we moved farther along Highway 199, we passed through Cave Junction, Oregon. The moment we entered that town, the uneasy feeling became more solid and noticeable. All of us felt it. There was something about the place that didn't sit right. It felt rough, sketchy, like the kind of area where you stay alert and don't linger. We noticed things that made us uncomfortable, and even though we could have used a bathroom break or gas, none of us wanted to stop there. Without really discussing it, we all agreed to just keep driving and get out of town as quickly as possible. After crossing into California, we went through a tunnel, and almost immediately after that, we decided to pull into the Collier Tunnel rest area. We needed to use the bathroom, and it felt like a relief to finally stop somewhere that wasn't Cave Junction. See, the rest area was surrounded by trees and felt fairly isolated. It was quiet, and when we pulled in, we noticed there was only one other car parked in the spots closest to the entrance. We parked 2 spaces away from it. As soon as we stopped, something caught our attention. There was a white dog wandering around the pet area. It looked like some kind of pit bull mix, or at least something similar in size and shape. What stood out was that it had no collar and there was no owner in sight. The dog wasn't acting aggressive, but it was clearly alone, just pacing and sniffing around. Because of that, we didn't want to let our own dog out yet. We stayed in the car and watched, waiting to see if someone would come claim the white dog. After a moment, my sister and I decided to go to the bathroom. As we walked toward the restrooms, we noticed a van parked nearby. Its doors were open, and there was a woman inside digging around through things. A man stood nearby, yelling at her. The situation felt tense, but what really stood out was the music. They were playing it loudly, and I clearly remember it being an Eminem song because it was one I recognized and liked. The volume felt out of place in such a quiet, forested rest area. Inside the bathroom, while I was washing my hands, my sister stood in the doorway with the door open. From where she stood, you couldn't see the van because of a divider between the bathroom entrance and that side of the parking lot. Even so, we could still hear the music clearly. It sounded just as loud as before, like it was coming from the same spot. We were only in there briefly. By the time we were done, the song had changed. But everything else seemed the same. When we walked back out, I didn't look directly toward the van again. I just assumed it was still there, still playing music. We walked back to the car, and my sister's partner went into the restroom next. My sister and I stayed behind, keeping an eye on the white dog. While we were waiting, we noticed the man from the only other car parked on that side of the rest area. He got out of his car and started calling for the dog. He looked like an older man, with a large white beard and a plaid shirt. He looked rough, like someone who had lived a hard life. The dog didn't respond to him at all. It didn't even look in his direction, which made me think the dog probably wasn't his. The man went back to his car, grabbed a dog bowl from the back seat, and walked toward the restrooms, presumably to fill it with water. When he came back, he sat in his car with the door open and continued calling for the dog. The dog kept wandering, uninterested, acting like it didn't recognize him at all. Around this time, another car pulled in and parked between our vehicle and the man's. Shortly after that, my sister's partner came back from the restroom. We all agreed it was time to leave. The situation felt strange, and the uneasy feeling I'd had earlier was starting to come back stronger. As we began pulling out, something happened that made my heart drop. The dog, the man, and his car were just gone, completely gone. There was no sound of a car backing out, no vehicle driving past us, nothing. The rest area was designed as a large loop. To exit, you had to drive around the circle and pass the entrance again. There was no other way out. That car would have had to drive past us, and we would have seen it. My sister and I reacted immediately, both of us asking the same questions at the same time. Where did they go? How did we miss it? We had been watching closely, waiting for them to leave so we could let our dog out. There was no logical explanation for how they could have disappeared without us noticing. Since the area now appeared to be free of the loose dog, my sister's partner pulled the car back around to the pet area. Normally, our dog wants out of the car the moment we stop anywhere. This time, he resisted hard. He didn't want to get out at all. We had to physically pull him out, which was completely unlike him. Once he was outside, his behavior was even more disturbing. He started sniffing the ground frantically, like he was overwhelmed by smells we couldn't detect. Then he jumped, suddenly, like something startled him, even though there was nothing there that we could see. He refused to go to the bathroom and kept acting anxious and on edge. At that point, the feeling of unease became overwhelming. It felt heavy and intense, like something was deeply wrong with that place. None of us spoke much after that. We got back into the car and continued driving, sitting in almost complete silence for a long time. The road stretched on, and the forest seemed endless, but all I could think about was what had just happened. That night, after we reached our hotel and had some distance from the rest stop, we finally started talking about it in more detail. That's when things became even stranger. My sister and I realized our accounts were identical. Every detail we remembered lined up perfectly. Then my sister's partner said something that gave me full-body chills. She told us that while we were in the bathroom, she had seen a young man in a black shirt get out of that same car and clap while calling for the white dog. According to her, there was never an older man with a white beard, ever. It was the same car, the same dog, but a completely different person. We all agreed there had only ever been one person involved, not multiple people switching places. Somehow, each of us had seen a different version of the same individual. Then my sister mentioned something else she hadn't said earlier. She told us that when we came out of the bathroom, the van that had been blasting music was already gone, and there was no music playing at all. That confused me deeply, because I clearly remembered hearing the music as we walked back to the car. In my memory, the sound never stopped until we were seated again. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started searching online and found many stories from people describing strange, unexplainable experiences in Southwest Oregon and Northwest California, especially around Cave Junction. Reading those stories only made our experience feel more unsettling and less isolated. To this day, I don't know what we experienced. I don't know if it was something paranormal, psychological, environmental, or something else entirely. All I know is that it felt real. All of us felt it, and it hasn't left our minds. That rest stop looked ordinary, but whatever happened there didn't feel ordinary at all. It was quiet, subtle, and deeply unsettling. And I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of being there. About 4 years ago, my husband and I were on a road trip. The kind of trip where you don't rush and you let the miles pass at their own pace. We had done many drives like this before, long stretches of road, quiet stops, and places that didn't always show up on travel guides. At the time, road trips felt normal to us, almost routine. We enjoyed being out on the open road, especially in areas where things felt less crowded and more natural. We were driving through southern Oregon, somewhere along the stretch between Grants Pass and Crescent City. I don't remember the exact date, but I remember the feeling of the day clearly. It wasn't late at night or bad weather. It was daytime, and everything looked fine on the surface. The sky was clear, the trees were tall and green, and the road was calm. Nothing about the setting should have made us uncomfortable. We eventually stopped at a small roadside park to eat lunch. It wasn't anything special, just one of those quiet pull-offs with a few picnic tables and trees around. The kind of place people stop at without thinking twice. There weren't many people around, maybe none at all from what I can remember. We parked, ate our lunch, and talked like we normally would. At that moment, everything felt completely normal. What stands out to me now is what happened after that. For some reason I still can't fully explain, we decided to drive down a dirt road that led away from the park and into the woods. This wasn't something we usually did. We weren't the type of people who randomly explored unfamiliar dirt roads without a reason. Even now, I can't remember why we chose to do it. It feels strange thinking back on it, like the decision didn't come from a clear thought, but just happened. The dirt road was narrow and rough, the kind that doesn't see much traffic. Trees lined both sides closely, and as we drove farther in, the forest seemed to close around us. At first, it felt ordinary enough. We had driven roads like this before. In fact, at the time, we lived in the remote woods of northern Idaho. We were used to isolation, dirt roads, long distances between towns, and being surrounded by forest. Those environments usually brought us peace, not fear. But as we continued down that dirt road, something began to change. The farther we drove, the more uncomfortable I felt. It wasn't a sudden panic or fear. It was a slow, creeping sense of unease that settled deep in my chest. I started to feel like we didn't belong there, like we had crossed some invisible line without realizing it. I remember looking out the window and feeling like the trees looked different somehow. Not in a dramatic way, just subtly wrong. The forest felt heavier, quieter, almost like it was holding its breath. The road seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. I kept expecting to see a clearing, a turn, or some sign that would make the drive feel normal again. But it never came. I noticed that my husband had gone quiet. He was focused on the road, his posture tense, his hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly than usual. That was when I finally spoke up. I told him that I didn't like the feeling of this place and that I thought we should turn around. What surprised me most was how quickly he agreed. There was no hesitation, no joking, no brushing it off. He said he felt the same way. That instant agreement made my stomach drop. If only one of us had felt uneasy, it might have been easy to explain away. But the fact that both of us felt it, without even needing to talk much about it, made it feel more real and more serious. We kept driving just long enough to find a place wide enough to turn around. The road was narrow, and for a moment I felt trapped, like we were being drawn deeper into the woods, whether we wanted to be or not. When we finally found a spot to turn the car around, the relief I felt was immediate but incomplete. Even as we turned back the way we came, that uneasy feeling didn't disappear. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see movement or something out of place, but there was nothing. No animals, no people, no sounds beyond the car and the wind. The forest stayed still and silent. We didn't talk much on the way back. There was no need. We both knew what the other was feeling. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. There was no adrenaline rush, no urge to scream or run. It was deeper than that. It felt like a warning, like an instinct telling us that staying any longer would be a mistake. When we finally reached the main road again, things slowly started to feel more normal. The road widened, the view opened up, and the presence of other vehicles helped ground us. Still, the memory of that dirt road and the feeling it gave us stayed with me. What makes this experience so unsettling, even years later, is that nothing actually happened. There were no strange sightings, no voices, no figures in the woods, no obvious danger, and yet it remains one of the most uncomfortable places I've ever been. We had lived in remote woods, spent time in isolated areas, and driven through places far more desolate than that dirt road. None of those places ever made us feel the way this one did. I've tried to explain it logically over the years. Maybe it was just unfamiliar territory. Maybe it was the isolation combined with a random decision to explore. Maybe our moods that day played a role. But no explanation ever fully satisfies me. The feeling was too strong, too sudden, and too shared between us to feel like coincidence. Even now, when I think back to that stretch between Grants Pass and Crescent City, I remember that heavy feeling settling in as we drove deeper into the woods. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was quiet, subtle, and deeply unsettling. It's the kind of experience that doesn't fade with time because it wasn't about what we saw, but about what we felt. Sometimes the scariest moments aren't the ones filled with action or clear threats. Sometimes they're the moments when your instincts speak louder than your thoughts, when something tells you that you don't belong somewhere, and that the safest thing you can do is leave. That's what we did that day, and even now I'm grateful that we listened to that feeling and turned back when we did. The place a strange weight. The building itself was old, really old. Built sometime in the 1700s, it looked every bit its age. Parts of it were falling apart, but it was still standing, stubborn and silent. Only a couple of electrical outlets worked, and even that felt surprising. The rest of the place felt frozen in time, like it was waiting for something or someone. I wasn't alone there. My girlfriend lived with me, and another guy named Cubby had claimed a loft in a separate section of the house. Cubby was a rough character, a junkie by his own admission, but even he seemed subdued in that place. We all kept to ourselves most of the time. The house was so big and so empty that you could go hours without seeing another person, even if you were all home. The land around the house only added to the isolation. A creek ran along the road nearby, part of the Brandywine watershed. Behind the house was a steep wooded hill, so thick and sharp that climbing it felt almost impossible without ropes. The nearest farm was miles away. There were no streetlights, no casual foot traffic, no reason for anyone to wander by, especially not children. One evening, I had been visiting my mom in town. I rode my bike everywhere back then, even long distances. But she didn't like the idea of me riding all the way back to that house after dark. She offered to drive me, and I happily accepted. Any time with my mom was time I appreciated, even back then when I pretended I was too cool for everything. When we arrived, she couldn't pull all the way up the driveway. Years of neglect had left it deeply rutted and uneven. You really needed a four-wheel drive vehicle to make it all the way up. She parked as far as she safely could, and we sat there talking for a while. Just normal mother and son conversation, nothing strange, nothing tense. After about 10 minutes, something caught my eye. At the top of the driveway, near the back door of the house, a small child was walking around. I don't mean a shadow or a glimpse. I mean a clear, solid toddler about 3 years old, walking calmly like they belonged there. I could see the way they moved, small steps, balanced, curious. My mom saw the child too. She asked me who it was. I was confused, but not frightened. At first, my brain scrambled for a normal explanation. I told her it must be the child of someone we knew, maybe visiting someone in the band. It didn't quite add up, but when something unexpected happens, your mind tries to force logic into it. We watched the child for a short while as we finished talking. Nothing about the child's presence felt rushed or dramatic. They were just there, quietly moving around near the house. When it was time for me to leave, I got out of the car and took my bike from the back. As I walked it up the driveway, the child was gone. I didn't think much of it. Kids move fast, I assumed. Maybe they went inside. I entered the house expecting to see someone else there. Maybe a visitor I hadn't noticed. But inside, it was just my girlfriend. No noise, no child, no adult. I asked her how Tanya had left without me seeing her. She stared at me like I had lost my mind. She told me no one had been there. No one had visited in weeks. Cubby hadn't had anyone over. His loft showed no signs of activity at all. That's when the feeling hit. Not panic, not fear, just a deep, cold realization that something didn't fit. My mom and I had both seen that child. Clearly, we had talked about him. And yet, There was no possible way for a toddler to be there. The house was too remote, the land too rough. There were no nearby families, no roads a child could wander from, no neighbors at all. Given the history of the place, the thought came naturally, even if I didn't want to admit it right away. Children had lived there once, many of them. Troubled kids sent far away from home, likely unhappy, likely scared. I don't say I saw a ghost lightly, but I know what I saw. And my mom saw it too. Over the years, my memory has faded in many ways. Faces blur, names slip away, but that child is still clear in my mind. The image, the moment, and especially the feeling stayed sharp. There were other places in that house where the feeling was even stronger. The kitchen, the barn. You could feel something there, something that didn't belong to the present. I don't know what it was, I don't pretend to understand it. But it changed the way I looked at stories I'd heard growing up. My grandmother used to tell ghost stories about the Old South, and I always thought they were just that. Stories. Interesting, entertaining, but distant. After that night, they didn't feel distant anymore. Nothing violent happened, nothing dramatic, and maybe that's why it stayed with me. It wasn't about being chased or threatened. It was about a quiet moment that didn't make sense, one that gently but firmly told me the world wasn't as simple as I thought. Even now, decades later, when I think about that house, I don't feel fear, I feel respect, and a reminder that some places remember the people who passed through them, whether we believe it or not. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, on large pieces of land surrounded by forests and tree farms that seemed to stretch on forever. As kids, my friends and I spent most of our time outside. We didn't have much supervision, and we didn't need it. The woods were our playground. We climbed trees until our hands were scratched and sore, followed deer paths just to see where they led, and wandered for hours without really keeping track of time. Being in the forest felt normal to us. It felt safe. It felt like home. Those woods were familiar in a deep way. We knew which areas were thick with brush, which paths flooded after rain, and which trees were easiest to climb. We knew the sounds of animals moving through the undergrowth, and could usually tell what was nearby just by listening. Most of the time, the forest felt peaceful and welcoming. Even when it was quiet, it never felt empty. That said, there were moments growing up that were uncomfortable. Every now and then, we would run into strange adults in places they shouldn't have been. Creepy old men appearing deep in the woods happened more often than people might expect. Most of those encounters were unsettling but explainable. Someone hunting, someone passing through, someone who lived nearby. Still, one encounter stands out to me more than any other because even now I honestly don't know if what we saw was a real person or something else entirely. Near one of the houses I lived in as a kid, there was an old abandoned place we called the Witch's House. The name wasn't very creative, but it fit. The house was falling apart. The windows were broken, the roof sagged in places, and the boards were rotted and dark with age. Even in full daylight, something about it felt wrong. None of us liked being near it. We never dared each other to go inside. We didn't throw rocks at it or try to explore it the way kids sometimes do with abandoned buildings. It genuinely scared us. Between my family's property and the witch's house was a massive stretch of blackberry bushes, thick, tangled, and sharp. You couldn't just walk through them. Even adults would struggle to get across without getting torn up. Because of that barrier, we never had any reason to go near the house, and honestly, we were grateful for the excuse. One afternoon, my friend and I were exploring farther out than usual. We came across a small treehouse at the edge of the woods. It wasn't fancy, just some old boards nailed together. But it felt like a discovery. The treehouse sat farther back, behind what would have been the abandoned house's backyard if anyone had still lived there. While we were checking it out, laughing and climbing around, we thought we saw movement near the back door of the witch's house. It was just a quick glimpse, but it was enough. We froze, stared, and then panic set in. We didn't wait to confirm what we had seen. We ran. Neither of us said a word until we were far away, back in an area that felt familiar again. We tried to laugh it off later, telling ourselves it was probably nothing, but the image stayed in our minds. About a week later, we were back in the woods again, this time farther north on my family's land. This area was well away from the witch's house, and it felt safer. We were climbing trees like we always did. Each of us picked our own tree and climbed up just high enough to feel hidden. Not high enough to be dangerous, but high enough that someone walking below wouldn't immediately see us. We were talking quietly when we heard branches snapping. The sound was deliberate, heavy footsteps, not an animal. We stopped talking instantly. My heart started to pound, and I remember gripping the branch I was sitting on so tightly that my hands hurt. We stayed still, barely breathing. Then an old man stepped into view. He came from the direction of the witch's house. He was dressed like someone from another time. He wore a worn cowboy-style hat, the kind that looked like it had been used for decades. His flannel shirt was faded almost to gray, and his jeans looked old and stiff, like they had been patched and washed too many times to count. He walked slowly, calmly, like he knew exactly where he was going. "Hello, girls," he said. My stomach dropped. How did he see us? From where we were sitting, we shouldn't have been obvious at all. I remember my mind racing. Had he been watching us before we climbed up? Had he followed us? Or were we just not as hidden as we thought? I knew not to talk to strangers. Everything in me screamed to stay quiet. I looked at my friend, hoping she would understand how scared I was. She was older than me, a little braver, and after a moment she said hello back. The man smiled gently. "I want you two to be careful in these woods," he said. "I have been around a long time, and I would not want you both getting hurt." There was nothing aggressive in his voice, nothing threatening. If anything, he sounded kind, but that somehow made it worse. The words didn't match the situation. He shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have known where we were, and he definitely shouldn't have been coming from the direction of that abandoned house. After saying that, he turned around. Without another word, he walked back the way he had come, toward the witch's house, and disappeared into the trees. My friend and I didn't move. We didn't speak. We stayed frozen in our trees, listening, waiting to hear footsteps again. But the woods went quiet. After what felt like a long time, we climbed down, hit the ground running, and sprinted all the way back to my house. For weeks afterward, we watched the abandoned house from the edge of my family's property. We brought binoculars and scanned it whenever we could. We looked for lights at night. We looked for movement during the day. We never saw anything. No cars, no smoke, no signs that anyone was living there or even visiting. To this day, I don't know who that man was. Maybe he was just a local who knew the land well. Maybe he lived nearby and wandered the woods regularly. But none of that explains how he appeared so quietly, how he found us so easily, or why he came from a place that felt so deeply wrong. After that encounter, we stayed closer to home. We still went into the woods, but whenever the air felt strange or our instincts told us we had gone too far, we turned back without question. And every time I thought of that old man, his calm voice, and his warning, whether he was real or something else entirely, the feeling he left behind was real. And it taught me to listen when the woods stopped feeling welcoming. Honey, and I didn't care. Freedom mattered more than comfort back then. That's how I ended up squatting in an old house far outside the small town I lived in. When I say far, I really mean it. This place was not just a little outside town. It was 12 to 15 miles away from anything you'd recognize as civilization in that era. Even by rural standards, it was isolated. You didn't accidentally drive past it. You had to know where you were going, and you had to be willing to go there. The house itself had a long and strange history. Long before we ever lived there, it had been used as a camp for troubled or wayward children. It was called Camp Linden. Kids from inner-city Philadelphia were bussed out there during the summers, sent far away from everything familiar. When you think about it, that alone tells you something. There was a reason it was placed so far from towns, families, and oversight. It was meant to be out of sight and out of mind. By the time we were living there, the place was old, really old. Built sometime in the 1700s, it looked like it had survived more out of stubbornness than care. Parts of it were falling apart, but it was still standing. Barely. Only 2 electrical outlets worked in the whole building, and even that felt like a miracle. We learned to live around it. I wasn't alone there. My girlfriend lived with me, and another guy named Cubby had claimed a loft in a different part of the house. Cubby was a junkie, but even he respected the place in his own way. The house was so big and empty that we could all be there at the same time and barely see each other. You could walk from one end to the other and feel like you were alone. The land around the house added to the sense of isolation. The road it sat on ran alongside a creek, part of the Brandywine watershed. Behind the house was a steep hill covered in thick woods. It wasn't the kind of hill you casually walked up. It was so steep and overgrown you'd need ropes to climb it safely. The nearest farm was miles away. There were no neighbors, no streetlights, no casual visitors. Even adults had no reason to wander out there. One evening, I had been visiting my mom in town. I rode my bike everywhere back then, even long distances, but she didn't like the idea of me riding all the way back to that house after dark. She offered to give me a ride, and I happily accepted. Time with my mom was always good time, even when I acted like I didn't need it. When we arrived, she couldn't drive all the way up the driveway. Years of neglect had left it deeply rutted and uneven. It curved in a horseshoe shape, and at that point, you really needed a 4-wheel drive vehicle to make it up. She parked as far as she safely could, and we sat there talking for a while. Just normal mother and son conversation. Nothing unusual, nothing tense. We must have been there about 10 minutes when I noticed something that didn't make sense. At the top of the driveway, near the back door of the house, a small child was walking around. I don't mean a shadow or a trick of the light. I mean a clear, solid toddler. About 3 years old, walking calmly like they belonged there. I could see the way they moved, steady and curious. My mom saw the child too. She asked me who it was. I was confused, but I wasn't scared yet. My mind immediately tried to make sense of it. At 22, I didn't know anyone with a child that age, but I reached for the closest explanation I could think of. I told her it must be someone we knew from the music scene, someone who occasionally showed up with a kid. Even as I said it, it didn't fully add up, but logic feels comforting when something unexpected happens. We watched the child for a short while as we finished talking. There was nothing threatening about the moment. The child wasn't crying or calling out, just quietly walking around near the house. When it was time for me to go, I got out of the car and pulled my bike from the back. As I walked it up the driveway, the child was gone. I didn't think much of it. Kids move fast. That's what I told myself. I went inside expecting to see someone else there, maybe a visitor I hadn't noticed before. But inside it was just my girlfriend. No child, no adult, no noise. I asked her how Tanya had left without me seeing her. She looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. She told me no one had been there, no visitors, no kids, no one. Cubby hadn't had anyone over either. His loft showed no signs of recent activity. That's when the feeling hit me. Not panic, not fear, just a deep, cold realization that something didn't fit. My mom and I had both seen that child. Clearly we talked about him, and yet there was no possible way for a toddler to be there. The house was too remote, the land too rough. There were no nearby families, no roads a child could wander from, no neighbors at all. Given the history of the place, the thought came naturally, even if I didn't want to admit it right away. Children had lived there once, many of them. Troubled kids sent far away from home, likely unhappy, likely scared. I don't say I saw a ghost lightly, but I know what I saw, and my mom saw it too. As the years passed, my memory faded in many ways. Faces blurred, names slipped away, but that child stayed clear, the image, the moment, and especially the feeling. There were parts of that house where the feeling was stronger than anywhere else. The kitchen, the barn. You could walk into those spaces and feel something press in on you, something you couldn't see but couldn't ignore. I don't know what it was. I don't pretend to understand it. But it changed how I viewed the stories I'd heard growing up. My grandmother used to tell ghost stories about the Old South, and I always thought they were just stories. Interesting, entertaining, but distant. After that night, they didn't feel distant anymore. Nothing violent happened, nothing dramatic. And maybe that's why it stayed with me. It wasn't about being chased or threatened. It was about a quiet moment that didn't make sense, one that gently but firmly showed me that some places carry memories, and sometimes those memories don't stay buried. Even now, decades later, when I think about that house, I don't feel fear, I feel respect, and a reminder that the past doesn't always stay silent, even when we wish it would. I still remember almost every small detail of what happened that night, even now, years later. It's one of those memories that never really fades. No matter how much time passes, thinking about it still sends a chill through my body. Back in May of 2020, when COVID had first shut everything down, I was a senior in high school. Life felt strange and unreal back then. School was closed, days blended together, and most of the time, we were just trying to find ways to escape the boredom and stress of everything going on. During that time, I spent nearly every day at one close friend's house. They lived in a small town in South Jersey, in what you could barely even call a neighborhood. It was really just two quiet side streets that connected at the top and formed a rough rectangle. Behind those streets was nothing but woods. Thick, deep woods that stretched on for miles with no houses in sight. There was only one narrow side trail off to the right that eventually led to another small neighborhood. But other than that, it felt isolated, like the neighborhood sat right on the edge of something much larger and unknown. One evening in mid-May, we were hanging out like usual. It was getting later, but not very late, and the air had that cool spring feeling to it. I remember walking through their garage and spotting a skateboard leaning against the wall. I had always wanted to learn how to ride one, and with nothing else to do, I thought it would be fun to try. We grabbed the skateboard and walked to the back street of the neighborhood, right where the road met the edge of the woods. There was a small hill there, perfect for practicing. The walk was short, maybe 2 minutes at most. As we got closer to the hill, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. Between two houses on the back street, there was a narrow dirt path leading straight into the woods. It caught my attention immediately. I remember slowing down and staring at it, feeling curious but not really thinking much of it at the time. I brushed it off and focused on the skateboard instead. I started practicing going down the hill, trying to balance and not fall. On one of my attempts, I hit what felt like the smallest pebble in existence. My board stopped instantly, and I went flying. I landed hard, and the pain in my wrist was immediate and intense. Later, I found out I had fractured it. That pretty much ended the skateboarding idea for the night. The next day passed slowly, and by the following night, my wrist was wrapped up and sore, but I was restless. I brought up the path I had noticed the night before and asked my friend if they had ever gone back there. They shrugged and told me they walked back there at least twice a week. That made it seem harmless. If they had been going back there regularly with no issues, what could go wrong? We decided it would be a fun little adventure, something different to break up the monotony of quarantine life. Looking back now, that decision feels incredibly stupid. That night, we each grabbed a small handheld flashlight. We didn't turn them on right away. The trail entrance was between the two houses, and we waited until we passed them before using the lights. The woods swallowed sound almost instantly, and the darkness felt thicker the farther we went in. I remembered that side trail leading to another neighborhood, but neither of us felt like going that way. Instead, we made another bad decision and stepped off the main path, heading deeper into the woods. At first, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural once you really notice it. After about 5 minutes of walking, we heard it. A loud crunch, like someone stepping hard on dry leaves and snapping sticks. It came from directly in front of us. We both froze at the exact same time and shined our flashlights toward the sound. There was nothing there. No movement, no animals, nothing. We told ourselves it had to be a deer or some other animal and tried to laugh it off, but the mood had changed. Neither of us felt relaxed anymore. We decided to turn in a different direction, away from where we heard the noise. About 5 minutes later, it happened again. The same crunching sound, again coming from in front of us. This time, when we shined our lights, there was still nothing. And then it started to rain. Just a light rain at first, but enough to make everything feel colder and more uncomfortable. That's when the fear really set in. We both knew, without saying it out loud, that something wasn't right. It felt like we weren't alone. I remember quietly telling my friend that we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but instead of immediately turning back the right way, we managed to get off the path again. Twice. Panic does strange things to your sense of direction. When we finally found the original path, the sound came back. This time, it was behind us. By heavy footsteps crunching leaves and snapping sticks, keeping pace with us. The rain started coming down harder, and our fear turned into full-blown panic. We started speed walking, then faster, until it felt like running was the only option. At one point, I turned around. What I saw still haunts me. 4 flashlights were coming toward us through the woods, moving fast, too fast. They weren't steady like someone casually walking. They were bouncing, closing the distance between us. That's when we broke into a full sprint. Somehow, in the chaos, we ran right past the exit of the trail that led back to the neighborhood. We didn't realize it at first. We just kept running until we reached a tall fence behind one of the houses. For a brief, terrifying moment, we considered trying to climb it. But with my fractured wrist, that wasn't going to happen. There was only one option left. We had to turn back. As we ran back toward the trail, the lights were gone. Completely gone. No sounds, no movement, nothing. That gave us a small sense of relief, but it didn't last. My heart was still pounding and my legs felt weak. I made it out onto the road first and turned around, begging my friend to move faster. They were walking out more slowly, trying to stay calm. That's when I saw them again. 4 flashlights running through the trees toward the trail entrance, right behind my friend. I screamed for them to run. They did. We sprinted down the street, adrenaline carrying us farther than we thought possible. When we reached the corner, I turned around one last time. Under a dim streetlight, I could see 3 or 4 figures standing near the trail entrance. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. We ran all the way back to my friend's house, slammed the doors, locked everything, and stood there shaking. It took a long time before either of us could speak. We were safe, but the fear didn't disappear right away. To this day, I refuse to go anywhere near that trail. I still don't know who those people were or what they wanted. We talked it over again and again, trying to come up with logical explanations. They weren't cops. If they were, they would have announced themselves, and there were no police cars anywhere. They couldn't have come from the side trail without us seeing them. That means they were already there, deep in the woods, watching us the entire time. What scares me the most is the silence. Not a single word was spoken, just footsteps, lights, and pursuit. I truly believe that if they had caught us, their intentions would not have been good. I don't talk about this experience often, but it's something I'll never forget. It was real, it was terrifying, and it taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I work full-time in healthcare, and anyone who has worked in that field knows how draining it can be. The job doesn't just take energy from your body, it takes it from your mind, too. Long shifts, constant pressure, responsibility for people's lives, and the emotional weight of it all can slowly build up until you feel completely overwhelmed. For me, one of the best ways to cope was going on long drives by the ocean. Sometimes I would go alone, sometimes with my best friend. But those drives became a kind of therapy for me. Most of the time we would go late at night. There was something peaceful about it. We would park near the water, look at the stars or the moon, listen to the waves, and just talk. Sometimes we laughed for hours. Sometimes we sat in silence. Either way, it felt like a reset button for my brain. Now, after a rough week at work, those night drives made life feel manageable again. They were some of my favorite memories, and I never once felt afraid doing them. That changed a few nights ago. It was a cold, dark night in November. Usually my shift ended at 11 p.m., but that night I didn't get off work until around 1 a.m. That's healthcare for you. I worked in a tiny town about an hour west of the big city. I lived roughly 45 minutes away, and when I finally clocked out, I was already exhausted and dreading the drive home. The wind was intense that night. As I walked across the parking lot, dry brown leaves spun around my feet, scraping against the pavement. I shivered as I got into my car, pulling my jacket tighter around myself. When my coworker arrived to relieve me, she mentioned something that stuck with me. She warned me not to take my usual route home on the newer highway. She said the wind was so strong that her car nearly felt like it was being pushed off the road. Instead, she suggested I take the old highway. The old highway ran almost parallel to the new one, but it was very different. It curved through thick forests, ran along the coastline, and had very few lights. Normally, I avoided it at night because it was dark and took longer, but safety mattered more than convenience. I agreed and headed out. As I drove, my headlights cut through walls of trees on either side of the road. Every so often, a strong gust of wind would push my car, just enough to make me grip the steering wheel tighter. All I could think about was getting home, taking a hot shower and crawling into bed. To keep myself awake, I turned on my Bluetooth and put on one of my favorite podcasts. The road was completely empty. I hadn't seen another car in over 20 minutes. There were no streetlights, only darkness, forest, and the occasional break where a small beach or a lonely house appeared and disappeared again. About 10 minutes later, I passed through a tiny town. if it could even be called that. It had a small grocery store, a drugstore, a couple of restaurants, and an old gas station. The gas station was basically a trailer with a few pumps. It sold cheap cigarettes and usually closed by 8 p.m. As I drove past it, I noticed something that stood out. An old truck was idling in the gravel parking lot. It was the first vehicle I had seen in a long time. I could see the outline of someone sitting inside. For some reason, it gave me a strange sense of comfort, and I wasn't the only one awake on the road. I kept driving, but the tiredness started to creep back in. About 10 minutes further along the highway, there was a small beach I loved. I had stopped there many times before, alone and with friends. I decided to pull over for a few minutes. I thought the cold air and the sound of the ocean would wake me up better than my podcast. It was stormy out, and I loved watching big waves crash against the shoreline during storms. I pulled into the gravel parking lot by the beach and parked at the far end. There were no other cars there. I rolled down my window, lit a cigarette, and stepped out for a moment to look toward the water. The wind was so strong it almost knocked the breath out of me. The cold air stung my face, and I instantly felt more awake. That was enough for me. I got back into my car. They turned the heat on high and leaned back in my seat. The salty air mixed with the sound of the waves, and for the first time that night, I felt myself relax. I was about halfway through my cigarette when headlights swept across my car. Another vehicle had pulled into the parking lot. It parked about 100 yards away from me and idled for a few minutes before shutting off. Suddenly, I was surrounded by darkness again. The only sounds were the wind and the waves. Almost immediately, I felt something twist in my stomach. A sense of unease settled over me, heavy and uncomfortable. It wasn't unusual for someone else to be there at that hour. People often came to the beach at night. Some walked along the shore, some smoked, some just sat and listened to the ocean. I had done all of those things myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the time. It was 1:40 a.m. Trying to calm myself, I lit another cigarette and told myself I would leave as soon as I finished it. The beach was unusually dark that night. Normally the moonlight reflected off the water, but that night there was almost nothing. I thought I heard gravel crunching, but when I looked around, I saw nothing. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion hit me again, and put my foot on the brake to start the car. For just a split second, the red glow of my brake lights reflected something in my rearview mirror. I wasn't sure what I saw. When I looked again, there was nothing. I laughed softly at myself, blaming my nerves and all the true crime podcasts I listened to. I tossed my cigarette out the window and put the car in reverse. Before moving, I glanced at my side mirror. My heart nearly stopped. There was a figure crouched beside my car, near the brake light. He was close, way too close. He appeared to be slowly inching toward my driver's door. My body froze for a second, pure shock locking me in place. Then instinct took over. I slammed my foot on the gas and reversed hard. The figure jumped back, and as I shifted into drive, my headlights illuminated a man in a dark sweater and jeans running toward the other vehicle. It was the same old truck I had seen at the gas station. Panic flooded my body. I floored it out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I was about 20 minutes from home, and the old highway was mostly one long winding road with very few places to turn off. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, praying I wouldn't see headlights. Then I did. The truck was behind me. I pressed the gas harder, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew I needed to find somewhere to turn off, somewhere to hide. As I rounded a sharp bend, the truck's headlights disappeared for a moment. That's when I saw it. a narrow gravel road coming up on the left. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the wheel, barely braking, and sped onto the road. The gravel road was barely wide enough for one car. It twisted and turned, hiding me from the main highway. After a short distance, I shut off my lights and rolled to a stop. I sat there in total darkness, shaking uncontrollably. I listened. All I could hear was my own breathing and the wind moving through the trees. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Nothing. Slowly, the tension began to ease. After giving myself more time, I turned the car back on, carefully maneuvered around, and slowly made my way back to the highway. The road was empty. I drove home without seeing that truck again. When I finally pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a long time before getting out. That night changed everything. I made a promise to myself that I would never go to that beach alone at night again. Some places hold danger, and sometimes you only realize it after it's too late. Both had a lot of experience in the outdoors. Agatha had been camping her entire life, and I worked as a wilderness survival guide. Between the two of us, we had encountered just about every animal you could expect in North American forests. Bears, cougars, wolves, elk, moose, all of it. We had also both run into strange people in the woods over the years, from people clearly living off the grid to stumbling across things that looked like occult rituals. None of that was new to us. We were calm, capable, and not easily scared. The place we were heading to that night was a dispersed campsite off a Forest Service road. Agatha had been there before and knew it was a good spot. It sat at a high enough elevation that light pollution was minimal, but not so high that snow was an issue. That time of year, snow was always a concern higher up the mountain. The clearing itself was roughly 150 feet across, mostly dirt and gravel with trees surrounding it. It was a solid spot for setting up a telescope. Although Agatha had been there before, I hadn't. Once we reached the clearing, I suggested we drive a little farther up the mountain to see if we could find an even better view with fewer trees blocking the sky. She agreed, and we continued up the road. A minute or two later, I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. About 60 feet off the right side of the road, I saw a tent set up at what looked like another dispersed campsite. That alone wouldn't have been strange, but there were a few details that felt off. There was no vehicle parked anywhere nearby, just the tent. It was also pretty cold to be camping in a standard three-season cabin-style tent. Nighttime temperatures at that elevation in September hovered around 30 to 40 degrees, and that night it was around 36. When I pointed the tent out to Agatha, she slowed down so we could get a better look. I was concerned that maybe someone had abandoned it. In situations like that, we would normally take it down and pack it out properly. As we slowed to about 5 miles per hour, I briefly shined my headlamp toward the tent. Be careful not to shine it directly inside in case someone was sleeping. In the few seconds it took us to pass by, it looked like the tent wasn't fully zipped, and I could see through the mesh door. It also looked oddly assembled, like parts of it weren't where they should be. We didn't think too much of it at the time and decided we would check it more carefully on our way back down. We drove another minute or two before the road narrowed sharply as it curved uphill. Forest Service roads are unpredictable, so that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was Agatha suddenly coming to a full stop. "I don't think we should go any farther," she said. I asked her why, and she paused before answering. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm turning around. Let's just go back to the original clearing." Her tone was off. She sounded unsettled, and maybe even upset. I assumed she was just eager to set up her new telescope, so I didn't push the issue. She reversed about 50 feet, turned the truck around, and headed back down. As we approached the area where we had seen the tent, I took off my headlamp and handed it to Agatha so she could shine it out her window. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. The tent didn't seem to be in the same place as before. It looked like it had moved 30 to 50 feet down the road and was now closer to the road itself. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a memory issue. We hadn't paid much attention the first time, after all, but that explanation didn't last long. Agatha suddenly stopped the truck and shined the headlamp directly at the tent on full brightness. I protested at first, worried that someone might be sleeping inside, but as soon as I really looked at it, the words died in my throat. I stared at the tent for several seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked wrong in a way I can't fully describe. The proportions were off. The angles didn't line up. It was like someone had taken the idea of a tent and scrambled it. Agatha finally spoke and said she thought it was upside down. That didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. The tent looked like a distorted painting of a tent. Poles and fabric were where they shouldn't be. Every time I blinked, it seemed to shift slightly. I looked away, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked back, the feeling of unease intensified. I asked Agatha if she could see anyone inside. She hesitated before answering and then said something that made my stomach drop. She said it looked like there were bare legs sticking up inside the tent. For a brief moment, I thought we were looking at someone who was dead or dying from exposure. I looked again, and for a split second, I thought I saw the same thing. Legs bent at the knees as if someone were lying on their back inside. But the view was through mesh, and nothing about it was clear. I blinked again, and in that instant, the mesh door appeared closed, and the legs were gone. The tent still looked wrong, still impossible to focus on, and my head started to hurt, as if my brain couldn't process what it was seeing. Agatha rolled up her window, shook her head, and said we should just leave. She rationalized that someone was probably sleeping in it. I don't know why we accepted that explanation, but we did. It was the only thing that made even a little sense. We drove to the original clearing and got out to set up. Almost immediately, something else strange happened. As Agatha walked across the clearing, she nearly fell flat on her face. This alone was odd. She was extremely experienced in outdoor terrain. A minute later, the same thing happened to me. I tripped over nothing. Over the next several minutes, it happened repeatedly to both of us. It felt like the ground wasn't where it should be, like our depth perception was off. We brushed it off and continued setting up. Agatha worked on her telescope while I laid down on a tarp with a blanket. She struggled to keep Jupiter in view. Every time she lined it up, it would be gone moments later. When I stood up to help, I noticed something else. The air above the ground was significantly colder. The ground itself felt strangely warm by comparison, as if there was a temperature pocket hugging the earth. We eventually gave up on the telescope and laid down to stargaze. I offered Agatha my blanket, but she declined, saying she wasn't cold. That was unusual. She was always cold. As I stared at the sky, I noticed something else that didn't make sense. The sky appeared split in half from east to west. One side was lighter than the other. Even stranger, the stars on each side were twinkling at different rates. When I pointed it out, Agatha confirmed she saw it too. Then the split reversed. We tried to rationalize it, but nothing quite fit. Later, Agatha mentioned seeing a light through the trees in the direction of the tent. I assumed it was a flashlight. We both relaxed again, lulled into comfort by the quiet. Then I woke up suddenly. There was no sound, no reason. I sat upright and looked toward the trees. I saw a light, then another, then another. 3 lights floating, not casting beams, moving in a triangular formation through the canopy. They were bluish and silent, rotating around each other as they moved closer. I shook Agatha awake, and we didn't hesitate. We packed up in seconds and drove out as fast as we could. The fear was overwhelming, primal, and immediate. We didn't speak until we reached the highway. To this day, I don't know what we saw. Each event alone could be dismissed. Together, they felt connected, and the fear we felt was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. Another minute or two passed when the road suddenly narrowed sharply and curved uphill. Forest Service roads can change quickly, so that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was Agatha coming to a complete stop before taking the curve. She sat there for a moment and then said, "I don't think we should go any farther." I asked her why, and she hesitated. "I don't know," she said. "I just don't think we should. I'm turning around and going back to the original spot." Her tone was off. She sounded unsettled, almost anxious. I felt a brief flash of concern, but I assumed she was just eager to finally use her new telescope and didn't want to keep driving. She backed the truck up about 50 feet, turned around, and headed back down the road. As we approached the area where we had seen the tent, I took off my headlamp and handed it to Agatha so she could shine it out her window. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. The tent didn't look like it was in the same place as before. It seemed to be farther down the road, maybe 30 or 40 feet from where I remembered it. It also appeared closer to the road itself. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a memory issue. We hadn't paid close attention the first time, but that explanation only lasted a few seconds. Agatha slowed to a stop directly in front of the tent, and without warning shined the headlamp at full brightness straight at it. I started to protest, worried that someone might be sleeping inside, but the words died in my throat as soon as I really looked at it. The tent didn't make sense. The proportions were wrong. The angles were wrong. It was like someone had taken the idea of a tent and twisted it into something unfamiliar. Agatha said she thought it was upside down, but even that explanation didn't fully work. The longer I stared at it, the worse it felt. It was like looking at a distorted painting of a tent, where nothing was quite where it should be. Every time I blinked, it seemed to shift slightly. I looked away, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, then looked back. The feeling of unease deepened. I asked Agatha if she could see anyone inside. She didn't answer right away. After a few seconds, she said something that made my heart jump into my throat. She said it looked like she could see bare legs sticking up inside the tent. For a brief moment, my mind went straight to the worst possibility. I thought someone might be dead or dying from exposure. I looked again, and for a split second, I thought I saw the same thing. Legs bent at the knees as if someone were lying on their back inside. But the view was distorted through the mesh, and nothing about it was clear. I blinked again, and in that instant, the mesh door appeared closed, and the legs were gone. The tent still looked wrong, still impossible to focus on, and my head started to ache. It felt like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, even though it was technically just a tent. Agatha muttered under her breath and then rolled up her window. She said we should just leave and that someone was probably sleeping inside. I don't know why we accepted that explanation, but we did. It was the only thing that sounded even remotely reasonable at the time. We drove back to the original clearing and got out to set up. Almost immediately, something else strange happened. As Agatha walked across the clearing, she nearly fell forward onto the ground. This was odd because she was extremely sure-footed and experienced with night walking. About a minute later, the same thing happened to me. I tripped over nothing and almost fell backward. Over the next several minutes, it happened repeatedly to both of us. It felt like the ground wasn't where it should be, like our depth perception was off. We tried to brush it off and continued setting up. Agatha worked on her telescope while I laid down on a tarp with a blanket. She struggled to keep Jupiter in view. Every time she lined it up, it would drift out of sight within seconds. When I stood up to help, I noticed something else that felt wrong. The air above the ground was significantly colder than where I had been lying. It wasn't a breeze or moving air. It was like the ground itself was holding warmth. We eventually gave up on the telescope and laid down to stargaze. I offered Agatha my blanket, but she declined and said she wasn't cold, which was unusual for her. As I stared up at the sky, I noticed something else strange. The sky appeared split in half, running east to west. One side looked lighter than the other, and the stars on each side were twinkling at different rates. When I pointed it out, Agatha confirmed she saw it too. Later, she mentioned seeing a light through the trees in the direction of the tent. I assumed it was a flashlight and didn't think much of it. We relaxed again, almost drifting to sleep. Then I woke up suddenly for no reason. I looked toward the trees and saw a light, then another, then another. 3 lights floating silently through the canopy in a triangular formation, rotating around each other and moving closer. They weren't flashlight beams, they were orbs. I shook Agatha awake and we didn't hesitate. We packed everything up in seconds and drove out as fast as we could. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. We didn't speak until we reached the highway. To this day, I don't know what we experienced. Each strange moment on its own could be explained away, but together, they felt connected. The fear we felt was real, shared, and unlike anything I've experienced.